space. But we'll start with panel number one, which I think, given kind of the startups we saw this morning and the things that Peter Yan discussed from Cyberport, which should be very interesting. We will have Eugene Xia, Chief Corporate Development Officer of the Hong Kong Science and Technology Park. We will have Ben Joffe, a partner at SOSV, and he will be joining us from Lisbon in Portugal. And we'll have Ted Sun, Executive Director of Digital Mobility for NEOM, and I believe he'll be joining us from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And to round things off, thankfully in person, we have the inimitable Dan Wong, ATEC Steering Committee, and also the GM of Global Innovation at MTR Corporation. So please give a big hand for our very international set of speakers today. Take it away, Dan.
Great, thanks for that. And welcome back from lunch. We have the first of a set of, I think, we hope to be quite interesting panels. And the first panel is around overlapping ecosystems. And it's interesting that we have a diverse set of panelists. I'm the only one physically here in Hong Kong, but I think it's quite fitting when we're thinking about ecosystems to look broadly. So I'm going to do a very quick introduction of our panel of speakers, and then we'll just dive right in because we do only have 45 minutes, and so I want to make sure that we have the right time. So in alphabetical order by last name, let me introduce our three speakers for today. Actually here, but remotely in Hong Kong, is Eugene Xia. And Eugene Xia, I would say, he spans kind of technology, large and small, right? In his current role, I mean, he is building and expanding ecosystems, Hong Kong into Greater Bay Area and beyond. But Eugene brings a very, very broad set of experiences. He founded, scaled, and sold his startup. Go. Hope everybody's okay. Are you all right? Okay, good. He sold his startup. Actually, sold to Agilent, I believe. And then after that, Eugene also spent a lot of time at lots of these big tech giants. At Agilent, Eugene was managing their worldwide operations and partnerships. And so I think, I think Eugene brings a very broad view in terms of different types of ecosystems globally. Second, by last name, is Benjamin Joffe. And I would say Benjamin, he is like the global citizen, from Beijing, where he first, first actually Japan, right? So Japan, right. Beijing, Shenzhen, Silicon Valley, now in Lisbon. And, I think Ben's background has very much been around helping to build ecosystems for startups. And so I can imagine nobody better to really talk from that angle. I want to say thank you, Benjamin. Benjamin is actually dialing in from Lisbon. It is 5:30 a.m. So thank you very much for dialing in. After this is done, you can have a coffee, watch the sunrise. And then last but not least, there's Ted Sun. And Ted is my ex-colleague at MTR, where he was a CIO of MTR for many, many years. And, Ted now is doing something very, very interesting. Ted is actually dialing in from the Middle East in Riyadh, where he often likes to send me pictures of him by the beach by the Red Sea to make me jealous. But Ted is actually building a city from scratch. And he will talk a bit about that later. So when we talk about ecosystems, certainly there's a part of that startups, but ecosystem is much broader than that. It goes from large to small. And to the topic today, and again, I can't imagine a better set of panelists we can find to talk about this topic. And I think the topic of ecosystem is so important. I don't care for companies large or small. Being able to leverage, tap into, and build ecosystems is part of everybody's playbook. Everybody needs to build ecosystems. I don't care if you're a startup trying to build your business. You might be a corporation doing digital transformation. You might even be a city like a Hong Kong thinking about how to become the next digital hub. So these are all ecosystem related. But I think doing ecosystems right is actually very hard to do, right? Why is it? How do companies tap into this? For example, why is it that some ecosystems fail and some succeed? And in today's world, where we live in the digital world, where everything is a click away, why is it that ecosystems, why does geography matter? Why is that? And finally, more broadly, again, in today's broad world, are ecosystems actually converging or diverging? And so these are the types of topics we will attempt to address with these experts in the following 45 minutes. And so to dive into that, why don't we first explore the geographical component of this, right? So again, to what extent, to all the panelists, do you think our ecosystems local? Are they regional? Are they global? Again, why is there a difference here? Why do things appear to cluster together in some places? And for example, let's say even at a city level, if you're like a city like Hong Kong, what are the implications in terms of ecosystem building? So let's kind of maybe explore the geographical component for this one. And I think for these questions, I'll just leave it open to all the panelists. And I think they all have a lot to share. I'll throw this question out there on this first topic. And I think in general, we'll talk maybe 2 to 3 topics in general to have a bit deeper discussion. So let me throw this first question out here, right? To what extent are ecosystems local, regional, global? Do they overlap? Do they diverge? Let me throw that out there. Who wants to go first?
Maybe I go first then.
You want to go? Okay, Ted, you go.
Okay, so since I'm here in Saudi Arabia, so maybe I talk a little bit about this part of the world. In particular, I'm now working on a project called NEOM, which is a mega project of the Saudi Arabia government. The initial investment is around 500 billion US dollars. So we build a smart region from scratch. So if from that perspective, we don't have anything, right? So we have to build from scratch. So right now we have people working here around 2,000 people, and people are actually, most of the people here is from all over the world. So we have people from more than 70 different countries. So in that perspective, you can see that this is a global market, right, in terms of intellectual resources. In addition to that, actually, we have many other consultant companies, workers all around this part of the region, building up the infrastructure, building up the roads, the bridges, the tunnel, everything here. So we like to have more innovative solutions coming from other countries, as we don't have anything here. So we really take on the expert on all over different industry. So span across from railway to food technology, to energy, to water, to architecture, to infrastructure, and to digital side. So just to give you an example, like the project I'm working on right now is actually building a digital mobility solutions for this part of the world, for this region. The size of NEOM is actually equivalent to the size of Belgium. Okay, so you can imagine there's multiple cities within this region. So this is what we are aiming to build: a digital services, a multimodal transportation system, serving the inhabitants of NEOM and also the visitors that will be coming into this part of the world. So we have to rely on many different partners within the ecosystem. So I guess is quite diverging and also convergent. I guess it depends on which kind of industry. For some industry, it might be quite mature already. It's quite well defined of the ecosystem. So it might not be that easy for newcomers coming into this region. Just to give an example, building heavy rail, okay, you cannot have many players in the world. There's only a limited number of players in the world. And also, if you talk about the digital mobility, the mass, the multimodal, although there are many players in the world, but it also depends on whether they have actually implemented very successful cases by integrating all different components in this particular multimodal. Just to elaborate a little bit more about the multimodal mobility system. So we know what we call mobility as a services, okay? In addition to that, we also have ticketing system, account-based ticketing system. So in many other parts of the world, in Europe, there are implementations on multimodal digital system with either only the MaaS or the account-based ticketing system, or the integrations of MaaS and ticketing system. And then on other cities, the city government, they really like to understand the road condition, the traffic condition of their city. So they have another components, what we call the authority oversight and steering. Okay, so but nowadays in all over the world, then there is not any single cases that have actually implemented all different types of components together. So my project is to integrate all these components together, and this is the first of its kind. Okay, so what I'm trying to say that you can see that it all depends on different components in different sectors, and also on the maturity, and also depends on the geographical location. For Saudi Arabia, we are building something from scratch. So definitely this is quite different from other parts of the world. Yeah.
That really is quite amazing. I think that's a good place to start our panel today, because I think there are three levels we can think about it, right? There's kind of regional level of ecosystem building. Ted, you're talking city level, right? Like, and in fact, building a city from scratch, which is, I think, is quite amazing. And then we also have the local level, right? Just even local plus startup. So kind of three levels that we can think about. And, so I think ecosystem is not just, startups. It's much broader than that, which I think this is good. On these other levels, whether it's regional level, right, local level, I wondered, Eugene or Benjamin, anything to add on top of that, layer on top of what Ted has just said?
Yeah, if I could talk about that. So ecosystems are really important to us at SOSV because we are a global VC fund focused on deep tech, and we invest all around the world. And we see that the startups we invest in have access to very different types of resources depending on where they are. So by living in multiple ecosystems, and you mentioned a few, like I lived in Japan, Korea, Singapore, China, Silicon Valley, now Europe. I kind of built this mental model of ecosystems that have basically 5 components. The first one is capital access. So capital from very early stage, like angel, all the way to late stage and even exits from M&As and IPOs. Then you have the access to markets. Sometimes your local market is big enough, and that's definitely the case for US and China. Rarely the case for other single markets. So capital access, market access to talent, also really important. And what Ted described is actually the need in some cases to basically bring talent from abroad. And the last 2 components are the regulatory environment, and that covers everything from company formation to company closing to actually talent import and all kinds of other like financing aspects, really regulatory, but also within specific categories, how friendly is this ecosystem to your particular technology category? And I can think of new alternative protein or all kinds of transportation that might be more or less regulated. And the last aspect that's a bit more nebulous sometimes to define is the cultural aspect related to the acceptance and the spread of kind of the entrepreneurial spirit. And eventually I found that this aspect was generally very much related to the fluidity of the job market. So if you operate in a job market that's very fluid, then the risk to start companies or join companies, and we all know that many startups don't succeed, actually that risk is directly related to what happens if you fail. And the US and China and some other ecosystems are very fortunate that if you join startups and if one startup doesn't really work out, you can very quickly find other jobs. So for all startups and our way of operating, so we focus on deep tech categories at the very pre-seed, the first check, basically, first money into those companies, typically with a handful of founders on the prototype. And what we found is that some ecosystems were more suited to what we're doing. So we opened a lab in Shenzhen to bring startups from all around the world to build hardware startups, leveraging the ecosystem in Shenzhen. That's very unique. COVID definitely threw a wrench into that, but what we found is that we could actually operate remotely with those teams. And some of our best companies actually started during COVID remotely with our Shenzhen team. And then we also operate biotech programs in San Francisco and New York. And those tap into the local talent, the local market, and the local capital sources. So those are the ways we look at ecosystems. So for talent is everywhere, but the resources to nurture those talents or nurture those companies are not. And we try to build bridges for companies wherever they are to where those resources are.
I think that's really interesting. I think that's a really good way, a good structure to think about ecosystems that will help our discussion today. And I think anybody who's listening in, right, these five aspects you mentioned, right? You had capital, market, talent, regulation, and culture. And I think kind of these, I guess what you're saying is that these are the core elements to consider for a successful ecosystem anywhere you go. I guess in some cases, if you don't have those elements, you might have to import it in some way. But I think as we think about that's quite, I think that goes across all the different levels we talk about, regional level to city level, even to local level. And I think kind of then as we take kind of maybe put that together a bit, maybe to you, Eugene, anything to build on top of kind of what we've discussed so far, maybe even at a regional level, because I know that Eugene, kind of you're looking at Hong Kong, but also beyond. Right, Science and Technology Park, right, has I think 6 locations. I think in Hong Kong, including there's a Hong Kong Shenzhen Innovation and Technology R&D Center, but also in Futian, across into Shenzhen and other places. And so I wonder if you might comment a bit in terms of kind of what you're doing in terms of, let's say, this regional level ecosystem building.
Sure. I'll build on top of what Ben and Ted mentioned earlier, right? I think building a ecosystem, whether successful or not, requires a lot of different considerations, right? Everything from talent to funding to your academia environment and so forth and so forth. So it's not something as easy to say, how do we build a very successful ecosystem within the shortest period of time using the least resources possible, right? It's almost impossible to say something like that. It's almost borderlining, how do we build the next unicorn, right? It's very similar. There's no magic formula. If there's a magic formula, everybody would have built a unicorn by now. So I think from our angle, it's really the way we see ourselves as more or less like a platform to really connect the right people, whether you're an investor or you're a corporate partner looking for innovation, to startups, entrepreneurs, to universities, professors, developing the next greatest things via your basic research and so forth and so forth. How do we as a platform really integrate all these different components together and increase the chances to for these people to come up with something new, right? To really impact the world. I think that's really the biggest challenge from our angle. So what Ben mentioned earlier in terms of the cultural aspect, definitely it's a major element, I think, in Asia, in terms of how quickly we can build up the next successful innovation ecosystem, right? So when I was working in the US, for instance, in Silicon Valley, the mentality and the culture is very different. People are a lot more risk-taking. They are willing to try something brand new, even though it might mean that you will be pouring your entire everything that you own into this little venture, and it will likely fail, and you will still go for it, right? But in Asia and Hong Kong, at least what I've been seeing for the last few years is ties back to, say, your family, ties back to your parents. Naturally, when you're in university, the first thing that they tell you is you better be a doctor or you better be a lawyer and something stable, right? The idea of taking risk, being an entrepreneur, go up there, try something completely new, it's not something that's encouraged. Although we are seeing quite a bit of change lately, I think a lot to do with how the government's pushing hard on innovation, the innovation culture. Definitely, we're seeing quite a bit of positive changes, and especially now that we go into the overall GBA area, we see Shenzhen, we see all the other Chinese cities really leapfrogging, right, in terms of their risk-taking appetite and also the innovation or innovative mindset. Definitely, I think Hong Kong sort of caught a glimpse of that and say, okay, we need to catch up, right? We need to do something quickly, and I think that sort of accelerate the change in the mindset. So it's overall it's very encouraging, but it's also very challenging. So.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's very interesting. I want to spend maybe 2 minutes just on that one area of culture, because I think it's so interesting, right? Because I think, like Benjamin, in your framework, right, that 5 framework, I think of the 5, I think the 4 are easy to quantify. Okay, you can quantify capital, size of market, talent, you can kind of like number of schools and, even regulation is all quantifiable. But yet what I hear all of you saying is that the culture component is quite critical. And I think in my mind, it's one of those areas you cannot, very hard to quantify. And all of you have been in different places before. And maybe just 2 more minutes just on this item of culture as it relates to innovation and ecosystem. From what you see in these different areas, are different places, let's say, because of culture, more able to attract and build ecosystems. Are some others not? If you're in a situation where you're trying to build that culture, and I don't care if it's a culture in a region or even inside a company or in your startup, how do you build culture? Just kind of, just very, very quickly, what have you seen on the culture? Who wants to go first? And it's interesting. Actually, Ted, I don't go to many panels with representation from the Middle East. Okay, and okay. So I think it's quite interesting to have you. And I want to learn myself. I've only been to the Middle East twice, just for business. But I think recently, just from my interaction, it seems like the Middle East is starting to become more of an ecosystem, right? There are a lot, right? You're building a whole smart city, right? That's amazing. But even in terms of things like Web3, and crypto, and I hear a lot of entrepreneurs and people say, hey, maybe the Middle East, place like Dubai, is the place to go. So maybe a bit of that, but then a bit of the culture. Maybe do you want to comment on that? Maybe to you, Ted. What's the culture like in where you are now?
Okay. I think before I came over here, I could not imagine how the metropolitan like here. Dubai, Doha, we're all watching at the World Cup right now, right? Okay. So you see how they build a whole new city only because of the World Cup, okay? And for Dubai, I think many people been there. It's a really, really fantastic, amazing metropolitan city. Again, you can see all different nationalities there. And because of all these different people coming from all over the world, it kind of some of the brainstorming, okay, and it come up all sorts of different innovative ideas. So this is the culture. This is the culture not only because of the city, not because of the country. It's because of so many different people coming all over the world to this particular part of the city, okay. And in Riyadh, and we also working right now in Saudi Arabia. There are many mega size of project, okay. Not only the one that I'm working on, they're working on the Red Sea project, turning Red Sea into a big resort, and they're working on Aluha. This is the middle in the desert. Many of these kind of projects coming up. So here, we always have the term living lab and living laboratory. Okay, so that means we welcome innovation. We welcome something happening new here. Okay, and I think this culture, it could be from the country, from the top down, from the organizations. I came from Hong Kong. I work in Australia. If I look back at Hong Kong, I think it's a little bit different from Middle East here. People here is really welcome all new sort of idea. We don't ask why we have to do it. We just say how we're going to do it, when we can make that accomplished. And this is one of the reasons that why I come over here, because I see that I'm working on something that have not been done before. It's first of its kind. It's not only on my project, it's also for other projects in Lyon. If you look at some of the YouTube research, the spine is never done before in other parts of the world. So this is a lot of innovations. You have to really have the courageous to try something new. So the way that we're working on, even for my project, we work on prototyping. We don't really, in Hong Kong, in some of the organizations, they will not talk about prototyping. They just want to make things perfect, right? How can we have things perfect, right? We are not perfect. None of us is perfect. So how can we develop something which is perfect? I think this is this culture. I think in particular, this part of the world, it's not only because of country, it's not only because of the organization, it's also because of all the talents coming from all over the world.
I mean, it's quite amazing for me to hear that kind of a culture in a place that, I granted I haven't gone to a lot, but I wouldn't quite imagine it's kind of that environment that you're kind of describing here. But Benjamin, Eugene, anything to add on top of that from your observations on the item of culture? Anything to add on top and build or other perspectives on this particular area?
Yeah, I see. So Benjamin, I'll go first. Sorry. So I see two fundamental layers, right, in terms of culture. The first one is really, if you tie back to the bell curve, which basically applies to everything in life, right? Population-wise, talent-wise, culture-wise, the top, say, 12 to 15% of the population, they always want to agglomerate together, right? They always want to be next to each other, right? Because the best attract the better people and so forth and so forth. So from an ecosystem perspective, how do you, first of all, really attract these top, 12, 15% of the population to your ecosystem, so that you gain that traction and momentum to attract the rest? I think it's a major exercise, not only in terms of finding the right opportunities for these sort of top talents, at the same time, how do you promote that? How do you market that to the rest of the world so that you get that sort of impression, right, to the other markets? So that's the first layer, right? I think the second layer is what Ben mentioned earlier in terms of the various components within the ecosystem. So culturally, even if I'm able to get, let's say, top 12% of the population, how do I get the other pieces within the ecosystem to really enable that 12% to become a lot better, right? I think culturally, your regulators, your policymakers needs to have the same mentality. Your corporations in the market have the same mentality to really adopt innovative solutions. Your investors must have that sort of mentality to say, this is a brand new business model, brand new technology I've never seen before. It might be worth something. I'm going to invest into it, right? So how do you keep that open-mindedness to really push the various components within the ecosystem together? I think that's really the trickiest part, I would say, in pushing that forward. So culturally, that is.
Yeah, very interesting. Benjamin?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to culture that to me matter quite a bit. One is the idea of a critical mass of people, because you have talented people really all around the world, but sometimes they're just not together. And if you can get enough people together, then suddenly, the weird thing, risky thing that you're doing, is a bit normalized in that environment. And from that perspective, actually, I've had many examples, I think actually Eugene and probably Ted is also examples of that when you go study abroad in such ecosystems, you get kind of an injection of that mindset thanks to the critical mass that you actually find there. And you take that with you when you leave the ecosystem. It becomes a more normal behavior. And even if you can't convince, your colleagues or your parents or your friends that what you're doing is normal, for you it is, because you've been around enough people that have the same mindset, and you had enough examples around you proving that to you. So I think it's kind of difficult to expect older generations that are more into the idea that you kind of you pick a career and you kind of set in that career and you're all set. It's not really the mindset that you can really carry in today's fast-changing world, particularly in technology. Rather, you have to be like a permanent learner, and you have to know how to learn very autonomously, rather than necessarily in the structure of an institution. So to get that mindset, sometimes you can find it locally, sometimes you have to go abroad to find it, and definitely being around and connected to more people. That has been mentioned by some of the other panelists, that being connected really matters a lot to reach that idea of critical mass as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Let's do this. Let's switch topics a little bit. And all three of you are very experienced practitioners. All right. And I think let's explore a little bit the question of, kind of how do you leverage or build your ecosystem? And I think kind of here today, there are three types of audiences, right? You could be a startup thinking about how do I leverage the quote unquote ecosystem to expand my business. And we had, pitches this morning, right? I mean, if you're a startup, how do you build and leverage an ecosystem around you to build your business? Second audience could be you're a member of a big, large multinational corporation, and you're trying to figure out how do I do digital transformation, how to go from 0 to 1. And, as many companies look at, ecosystem is part of that playbook. How do I do that from a corporate level? Then I think even at a broader regional level, let's say Hong Kong, right? Oh, how does Hong Kong become a hub? I think you hear that? Okay. Yeah. So I think on those three levels of practitioners, what kind of advice, and based on your experience, would you give to any one of those? Or how do you really build your ecosystem and leverage it? And I'll throw that to all three of you, whoever wants to jump in first. Who wants to go?
Yeah, maybe I go first again. Okay.
Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah. Okay. I think I look at it from two different aspects. Okay. If I look at it from my experience learned in the Asia Pacific region, in particular in the last several years in Hong Kong, I think from a corporate-wise perspective, a company, first of all, they should be able to work closely together with those innovation hubs like Science Park or Cyberport. And at least they have to let the people in those areas understand what will be their business plan, whether they have some interesting initiative that will be coming up. On the other hand, they should also work closely together with maybe universities or maybe other sectors. So try to understand more about the emerging technologies. Try to understand how to apply those technology into their respective area. Quite often I see people, they are either complacent, think they are all the best in the world. So they can do whatever they like if they can come up something new by themselves. I think that is not a good approach or mentality on that. And for the other part of the ecosystem, I think for the startup people, for entrepreneurs, they also have to understand more about the market. Okay, I also see startup entrepreneurs, they're very innovative, but not necessarily addressing the pain points of some organizations. It could be good for the general public, so it depends on which market they really want to address. If they want to address those business problems or solve something for the overall people in that particular city, then that might be different from what they really want to help some organization or large enterprise to address their business pain point. So again, I think the whole ecosystem starts from government to university to Science Park, Cyberport, Australia in Hong Kong, and then with the organizations. And finally, we go to the fundamental questions: is the talent, the resources, whether there are enough resources in that particular city to help them to address the issues. And if they don't have that, then how they going to build a larger ecosystem outside that particular city? And I think that is very, very important.
Great. Thanks for that very practical advice. Actually, one more, I guess, audience segment that I forgot to mention, in addition to startups or corporations or cities, we also have lots of people that are VCs and PEs in the audience as well. So again, maybe for them, and for example, kind of Benjamin and Eugene, you're both also investors as well. So even for that segment, I mean, when you're thinking about, okay, where do I put my investment dollars? Which ecosystems, which areas? I think that's maybe another aspect as well. So kind of 4 aspects. So along those 4, I guess, Eugene or Benjamin, anything to add in terms of practical advice for how do you tap into ecosystems or build ecosystems?
So I can speak toward the startup and VC aspects. So as investors, we've backed over 1,000 companies, and a large part of them are outside the US. About half is North America, quarter Asia, quarter Europe, and rest of the world, including South America. And what we found is that there's very different types of resources depending on the ecosystem you operate in. To give one example that might be a bit surprising is that in South America, there are actually hubs of talent for biotech. And we discovered that in the past few years, and we've now backed well over a dozen startups from those hubs. And they have access to great talent that have been trained overseas, that is super affordable. Like we're talking, $1,500 per month for a PhD, in South America, that's been trained in a US university, for instance. So this is like unreachable price in the States and in most ecosystems. But they don't have access to a lot of capital. They don't have access to great customers. And what those companies do with us is to understand how to access those customers, how to access this capital, and kind of establish a beachhead in the US or in other relevant markets. So I'd say as startups, wherever you're from, you have to figure out what is your ecosystem offering and where are the other resources you might need and how to access them. And you can try to go on your own, but it's a lot more difficult to build credibility with corporates, understand how to talk to VCs if nobody tells you, because it's really a kind of different language that what typical researchers, for instance, I used to do. Now for VCs, you could say it's kind of similar, but also thinking in terms of what markets are crowded and what markets are not crowded. So we decided to focus on deep tech pretty early on, about 10 years ago, when at that time everybody was doing software essentially. And we said, okay, we're going to do hardware, and then we said we're going to do biotech, but like new biotech with the advances of synthetic biology that now enables like a new kind of Moore's law in biology. And if you look at opportunities like this, either by type of technologies or by geography, you can find underfunded markets. Another way to look at it is to look at some emerging markets and to apply playbooks from other markets. For instance, these days we also invest a lot in emerging markets in Africa, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India. And many of those companies actually interested in applying the China playbook that we're very familiar with for many software companies. So when you find those kind of, let's say, arbitrage opportunities or first mover advantages, you can find opportunities as investors.
So Benjamin, you're almost talking about, if I hear you correctly, you're almost talking about connecting ecosystems, right? So for example, in your example, South Africa, I mean, it has good talent. I mean, if you're saying 1,500 for a PhD, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I don't know how you find that, right? And I don't know if you knew that before you went in, but then you connect that talent ecosystem, if you will, with the market, which it lacks, right? So kind of almost, I think, just kind of tapping on top of what you're saying, in today's world, if you're thinking about really leveraging ecosystem, you have to have a global view almost. And, how do you piece these different pieces together so that you have all those 5 elements, right? So I think that is one thing that I'm taking away from your sharing there, right, in those examples. Eugene, anything to add on top in terms of, again, this topic of really in a very practical perspective, figuring out how to, now I guess, I think the good news is in the old days, maybe if you're trying to do something, you need to spend your own money and budget to do it yourself as a company. I think now the new playbook, right, that everybody's doing, okay, I don't do it myself. I leverage the ecosystem. Somebody else does it for me. And so therefore 1 + 1 = 10 or something like that. And so I think that's the good news. But then again, back to the practical level here. Eugene, any experience or advice that you can give to the audience here, just kind of based on your many years of experience across all these different areas?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, being an entrepreneur is probably one of the most difficult things you can ever do in your life. But at the same time, one of the most rewarding ones, because you will be exposed to a lot of different disciplines that otherwise you would never be able to get exposed to, right? So definitely a extremely fun journey to take on. In terms of leveraging ecosystem, I think really depends on where you are in the world. Each ecosystem has its strengths and weaknesses, and we cannot really expect a particular ecosystem to be say 100% comprehensive in terms of what it offers to all the participants within the ecosystem, right? So like you said, or like you mentioned earlier, that whether we still need to leverage each other from an ecosystem perspective, whether it's global or regional or even local, definitely there's still that need. But unfortunately, I think the world is certainly getting divided into the East versus the West at the moment, right? So that sort of play is becoming more and more challenging and more sensitive as we move on, especially say in the semiconductor industry. We're starting to see some trends in the biotech area as well. So essentially it's the East versus the West. How can we build as quickly as the West or even surpass the West? Unfortunately, that's just the reality that we're facing with, as much as we hate it. But this is the stuff that we're seeing at the moment. But eventually, I think being an entrepreneur, you got to survive on your own. Really go out, find your customers, find the investors, validate all the ideas, continuously improve your products and so forth, customer experience and on, right? So these are the universal truth no matter where you are. So yeah.
Well, that's really good. I think we are getting to time. And so I do want to have one final quick question, just maybe, Eugene, tapping on your just last point of, let's say, East versus West. And so, kind of maybe the final question, maybe each of you, maybe a couple of sentences on this question of, ecosystems overlapping or non-overlapping. And I'm curious what you're seeing, okay? So, with all these different ecosystems, I mean, is there some convergence? Maybe in the sense of what Benjamin was saying, that, okay, you're connecting them and that's kind of the trend moving forward? Or from your experience and what you're seeing, is it actually opposite, especially with the geopolitics and these ecosystems are becoming more and more separated and fragmented and self-sufficient? What is it that you're seeing in terms of this question of ecosystems either converging or diverging in the last 2 minutes? Who wants to go first?
Again, me.
Hey, Ted, go ahead.
Yeah, if you mention the geopolitical aspect, I think it should not happen, okay, if for innovation ecosystem. I see it's diverging and overlapping because if you look at from the supply chain perspective, from the source of fund perspective, and for the talent perspective, there are some areas that are overlapping even across different disciplines, different industry. So I think in the end, what we like to see is diverging, overlapping, and open-minded.
Great, thank you. Who's next?
I'll go next. I think it's really. So sorry. So I think it's really a love-hate relationship, so to speak, right? If I take the semiconductor industry as an example, your EUV, the extreme ultraviolet manufacturing process controlled by ASML and really TSMC, that those technologies are naturally out of reach for the East, right? But at the same time, the raw materials are coming from China, right? So you've got to work together to produce a chip, but at the same time, the different power entities, I would say, still wanted to fight, right, to ensure that there's you minimize the risk to make sure that no single country would control everything, right? So I think it's really of a love-hate relationship that but we'll learn to coexist. I think eventually we'll find the equilibrium, right? So.
All right, Benjamin, wrap it up for us. Tell us the answer.
I agree that ecosystems are constantly evolving, both locally and globally. China is definitely China and US particularly gradually decoupling in many aspects. But this also creates opportunities because now every country, following COVID, following the energy crisis in Europe, following geopolitical issues, is vying for more independence in terms of energy, in terms of food, in terms of industry. So you have now companies looking at opening rare earth mines and processing centers in the US or in Europe, or battery companies that are emerging in Europe. So every situation creates opportunities. Unfortunately, I think in terms of flow of talent, flow of capital, on the ability to expand to different markets, it's more difficult today. Definitely, if you want to, straddle several ecosystems, especially US and China. But still, a lot of opportunities. And I think my final words is that if you decide to go the entrepreneurship route and build a startup, it's a hero's journey. You will have obstacles, and you also have allies. So spend time finding the right allies, and you can overcome those obstacles.
Well, Eugene, Benjamin, Ted, I wish we had another several hours to explore this very, interesting and complex item. But we're at time, and I want to say a big thank you to all of you dialing in from 3 corners of the world. Thanks again for this panel, and hopefully I'll see you at some point soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, as well. Great.